The construction site is a sprawling, rain-slicked hellscape on the outskirts of the city, dominated by the skeletal steel frame of a new, massive data center. The air tastes like ozone and wet concrete. Luke is at the bottom of a deep excavation trench, his muscles aching, his hands caked in mud. He's running a pneumatic drill, but the vibration feels wrong today. It doesn't shake the ground, it makes the air ripple like heat haze on hot asphalt. He kills the engine. Silence falls, a heavy, artificial silence that shouldn't exist in a city. Above him, on the edge of the pit, a woman in a high-vis vest and sleek, tactical-looking gear stands staring at a tablet. She doesn't look like a site inspector. She looks like she's reading the architecture of the air itself. "This is Elara. You're not supposed to be digging here," she says, her voice cutting through the silence without needing to be loud. Luke wipes sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of gray sludge across his forehead. "Foreman said dig. I dig. Why? What's under the slab?" Elara looks down at him, her eyes scanning his face with a desperate, clinical intensity. She jumps down into the pit, landing with a grace that defies the thick, uneven mud. She walks toward him, and as she nears, the air around them begins to stutter. The image of the steel beams behind her flickers. For a microsecond, they look like translucent, shifting scales. "You aren't supposed to be able to see the flicker," she whispers, her gaze locked onto his. Most people's brains just auto-correct the visual data. They write it off as a headache, or a trick of the light. Luke stands his ground, the heavy drill held loosely at his side. He feels a strange, electric pull in his chest, a feeling of recognition that shouldn't be possible. "I've been seeing it for weeks. The world, it's got gaps in it. Like a bad repair job." Elara reaches out, her hand trembling as she touches his arm. The contact is electric. Suddenly, the construction site vanishes from Luke's vision. He sees a flash of something else. A sprawling, sterile chamber filled with millions of glowing pods, and towering, reptilian shadows moving between them with cold, calculated efficiency. He gasps, pulling back, and the vision snaps like a broken rubber band. They are back in the pit. The rain is still falling, but the sky above the construction site now looks like a low-resolution digital matte painting. "My name is Elara," she says, her voice urgent. "I helped them build this prison. And I think you're the only person who can help me burn it down." Luke looks at his calloused, mud-covered hands, then back at her. The normal world he's been trying to survive in for years suddenly seems like a dream he's finally waking up from. "I don't know who you are," Luke says, his voice gravelly and calm, "but I've been waiting for a reason to tear this place apart. Tell me where to start." The moment Elara's hand touched Luke, the air in the trench didn't just flicker, it screamed. A low-frequency hum, deep enough to vibrate the marrow in their bones, surged through the site. Above them, the site's automated surveillance drones, which usually hovered like indifferent hawks, snapped to a halt. Their lenses rotated in perfect unison, locking onto the trench. "They've flagged the variance," Elara hissed, pulling a small, jagged piece of obsidian-like glass from her vest. "They know we're out of sync." Suddenly, the construction workers above the pit stopped moving. Their motions weren't human. They were jerky, frame-skip movements. Two of them jumped into the pit. They didn't land with the thud of work boots. They landed with the sickening, fluid thud of heavy, wet meat. As they stood, their skin rippled, a momentary, translucent flash revealing dark, hexagonal scales beneath the synthetic human facade. "Enforcers," Luke grunted, hefting his industrial drill like a mace. "Whatever those things are, they aren't wearing hard hats for the safety." The enforcers didn't speak. They lunged. Luke moved with a lifetime of blue-collar instinct. He swung the drill, not at the enforcers' heads, but at the scaffolding pipe behind them. As the metal groaned and twisted, Elara slammed the glass shard into the dirt. A shockwave of distorted reality rippled outward, turning the ground into a liquid, non-Euclidean trap. The enforcers stumbled, their forms glitching violently as they tried to recalculate their position. "Move!" Elara screamed. They scrambled out of the trench, sprinting through the skeletal frame of the data center. The world around them was falling apart. Walls dissolved into streams of raw code, and the sky turned a deep, bruised violet. They reached the edge of the site, where a rusted, nondescript cargo van waited. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't look back until they slammed the doors shut. Silas turned the key. The engine didn't roar. It emitted a high-pitched, crystalline chime that immediately canceled out the humming threat behind them. The sight vanished in the rearview mirror, replaced by the mundane, flickering lights of the city highway. "You're late," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the road, though he didn't seem to be looking at the pavement. He was watching the weather, the way the streetlights stuttered in a rhythmic code. "They found the anomaly," Elara breathed, clutching her side. "They're running a hard reset on the sector." Silas nodded, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen the universe end 1,000 times. He looked at Luke in the rearview mirror. "You smell like raw earth, boy. That's good. It means you haven't been synced yet." "Who are you?" Luke demanded, his adrenaline slowly fading into a cold, hard rage. "I'm the one who stops you from being recycled," Silas replied. He pulled the van into a dark, abandoned industrial tunnel. "You've spent your lives thinking you were drifting, working, and living. You were just fuel for their server banks." He hit a switch on the dashboard. The van's interior lights went black, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to peel away, revealing a hidden, subterranean bunker built into the side of an old, abandoned subway line. "Welcome to the real," Silas said, stepping out into the damp, cold dark. "Now, let's talk about how we kill a god." The air in the basement of the Central City Data Center was freezing, a calculated, industrial cold meant to preserve silicon, not human flesh. As the trio stepped out of the maintenance shaft into the primary server chamber, the silence was absolute. But it was a predatory silence. "They're not here," Elara whispered, her voice tight. She scanned the room with a handheld frequency reader, but the device just emitted a flat, dead tone. "The security protocols are offline. The entire sub-level is empty." Silas didn't move. He stood at the threshold, his eyes fixed on the center of the room, where a massive, crystalline pillar hummed with a soft, bioluminescent light. Suspended within it, encased in a web of fiber optic cables that pierced his skin like acupuncture needles, was Dr. Aris Thorne. "It's a trap," Silas said, his voice devoid of surprise. "We were never meant to sneak in. We were meant to be lured." As if triggered by his words, the overhead lights didn't flicker, they inverted. The harsh white shifted to a nauseating, ultraviolet spectrum. The shadows in the corners of the room began to detach from the walls, stretching and thickening into tall, serpentine forms. The reptilian elites didn't emerge from the dark, they simply phased into existence. They stood 7 feet tall, their skin a shifting mosaic of iridescent scales that seemed to absorb the light. They weren't wearing suits or disguises now. They looked like they were made of oil and ancient malice. At their center stood one who seemed to command the space. Its eyes, vertical slits of burning gold, fixed immediately on Luke. "You are the 7th version," the creature hissed, not with a mouth, but with a resonant, vibrating hum that bypassed the ears and manifested directly in their skulls. "The 7th iteration of the Drifter, Luke. Every time, you find your way here. Every time, you believe you are the one to break the cycle." Luke felt the lead gauntlet on his hand go hot, vibrating in sympathy with the creature's voice. He stepped in front of Elara and Silas, his knuckles white. "If you've seen me do it 7 times, Luke growled, his voice steady despite the overwhelming pressure in his mind, "then you know I eventually find a way to make it hurt." "We do not fear the pain of an ant, Luke," the elite replied, its form undulating as it took a step forward. "We require the friction. You are the spark that keeps the engine running. You are the catalyst for our harvest." It gestured to Dr. Thorne, who remained frozen, his eyes wide and vacant, an eternal witness to his own nightmare. "We did not bring you here to stop us. We brought you here to witness the final integration. Today, the loop closes for good." The room began to fold. The walls shifted like liquid mercury, sealing the exits. The floor beneath them dissolved into a digital void, leaving them standing on a narrow platform surrounded by a sea of static. "Silas," Luke said, not taking his eyes off the creature. "You said there was a password. If he's the processor, how do I talk to him?" "He's not a computer anymore," Silas shouted over the rising roar of the room's cooling fans. "You have to match his frequency. You have to reincarnate, voluntarily. Dive into his stream, hold on to your sense of self, and overwrite the system from the inside." Luke didn't hesitate. He looked at Elara, whose face was a portrait of terror and profound trust, then at the pulsating, crystalline pillar. The static sea beneath his feet was already rising, smelling of ozone and ozone-charred memories. "If I don't come back," Luke shouted over the deafening hum, "don't let them rewrite the file." He didn't wait for a response. He lunged at the pillar, jamming his lead-encased gauntlet into the center of the fiber-optic web. The impact wasn't physical, it was an implosion of consciousness. The world turned into a blinding, torrential downpour of binary code, screams, and centuries of stolen lifetimes. Luke felt his physical body disintegrate, his sensation of Luke stretching thin across 1,000,000,000,000 miles of digital wiring. He was being dragged through the reincarnation trap, a high-speed tunnel of light designed to strip a soul of its identity and reformat it for the next life. He saw the faces of the millions being harvested, flickering, transparent ghosts trapped in the loop. Resist the light, he commanded his own fraying mind. He found the core drive. Aris Thorn. Thorn wasn't a person anymore. He was a knotted mass of agonizing calculations, the engine that sustained the illusion. Luke dove into the center of the knot, bracing himself as the reptilian firewalls slammed into him. They weren't fighting him with weapons. They were attacking his memories, trying to override his sense of self with a fabricated history of a pathetic, submissive life. "You are a worker. You are a tool. You are the fuel," the system whispered into his soul. Luke clawed back. He remembered the smell of wet earth in the trench. He remembered the specific, electric heat of Elara's hand. He remembered the raw, ugly, beautiful defiance of being a man who refused to be managed. He gripped the core of Thorn's consciousness. The admin password wasn't a word, it was an act of pure, unadulterated human will. It was the decision to stop. "Wake up!" Luke roared into the silence of the machine. He poured his own, unsynced, low-frequency energy into the pillar. He wasn't just hacking the system, he was poisoning it with the truth. In the physical world, the reaction was cataclysmic. The crystalline pillar shattered, sending shards of light tearing through the room like shrapnel. The reptilian elites shrieked, a sound that wasn't of this world, as their sleek, shifting forms lost cohesion, turning into jagged, dark shadows that dissolved into the rising static. The data center began to fold inward. The reality mesh was tearing. Outside the bunker, above the city, the sky began to lose its low resolution, matte painting look, and for the first time in an age, the real stars, frightening, infinite, and ancient, began to bleed through the digital veil. In the center of the ruins, Luke's body slumped to the floor, motionless. But his eyes were wide open, staring at something only he could see. Elara sprinted to him, falling to her knees. She grabbed his shoulders, her own heart hammering against her ribs. Luke. There was no pulse, but as she leaned in, she heard it, not from his chest, but from the air all around them. A low, rhythmic, human heartbeat, vibrating through the very foundation of the building. The loop was broken, but the world they were waking up to was entirely, terrifyingly new. The simulation has collapsed, and the real world is flooding back in. The air in the chamber grew unnaturally thin, and the temperature plummeted until their breath frosted. The reptilian elite poised to strike stopped mid-lunge, its eyes darting toward the ceiling, not the concrete ceiling of the data center, but the patch of sky visible through the jagged hole they had just blasted into reality. A beam of light, pure and blindingly white, not the ultraviolet, reset, light of the simulation, but a clean, golden hue, pierced the gloom. 3 figures descended, hovering inches above the debris. They were tall, ethereal, and possessed a terrifying, statuesque beauty. Their skin had the luminescence of moonlight, and they were dressed in armor that appeared to be woven from shifting starlight and liquid mercury. The reptilians hissed, recoiling. They didn't retreat because they were defeated. They retreated because they recognized the hierarchy. "The architects of the First Age," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "The Nordics." One of the figures, a woman with eyes that held the swirling nebula of a galaxy, stepped forward. Her voice didn't vibrate in their skulls like the reptilians, it resonated in their hearts. "The prison has fallen, but the harvest has merely entered its final phase." She looked at Luke, her gaze scanning him as if reading his very DNA. "You have done what we could not, child of the mud. You broke the frequency. But you have unleashed an ancient hunger that no longer needs to hide. Who are you? Luke stepped forward, his knuckles still raw from the fight, the lead gauntlet sparking with leftover static. We are the watchers of the garden you were never allowed to tend, the Nordic guardian replied. She raised a hand, and a ripple of energy pulsed outward, creating a shimmering, protective dome around the trio. The reptilians circled the perimeter, pacing like caged beasts, their patience chilling. The reptilians are not native to this world, she explained. They are parasites who arrived when the stars were young. We have guided your evolution from the shadows, waiting for a human to possess enough, unsynced, will to shatter the veil. You are the first to survive the breaking of the loop. She handed Elara a small, pulsing crystalline device, a weapon of pure harmonic resonance. The frequency the reptilians used was ours, stolen and twisted into a cage. We have come to reclaim it. We will train you to use the sonic frequencies of the cosmos to strike back. Silas looked at the looming reptilians, then at the graceful, terrifyingly powerful beings who had just revealed themselves. Why now? Why not thousands of years ago? Because, the guardian said, looking toward the horizon where the real, dark sky was beginning to glow with the activity of a waking, panicked world, humanity had to choose its own freedom. A gift of freedom is not truly yours until you fight for it. The Nordic woman turned her gaze to the reptilian leader. The war for the surface begins today. And this time, the food will fight back. The alliance is struck in the ruins of the data center, beneath the cold, uncaring light of the real stars. For Luke, Elara, and Silas, the arrival of the Nordics feels less like being saved and more like being recruited into an interstellar resistance they barely understand. The Nordic guardian, who introduces herself as Ethel, explains that the prison wasn't just a digital cage, it was a sensory dampener. Now that it's down, the humans can actually see the invisible infrastructure of the war, the ley lines, the energy conduits, and the hidden gateways the reptilians use to move between their underground hives. The training of the resistance. The trio is relocated to a blind spot in the high-altitude Andes, a location that the Nordic technology keeps invisible to any radar or thermal scan. Here, the training is brutal and transformative. Sonic warfare. The Nordics teach them to manipulate the harmonic resonance of matter. Luke learns that his blue-collar intuition, knowing how to drill, how to build, and how to break, is actually the key to finding the structural weaknesses in the reptilians' physical forms. The site, Elara, the data analyst, discovers that the Nordics' technology is just advanced math. She begins to code the battlefield, overlaying tactical maps onto the physical world, showing the resistance exactly where the reptilians are attempting to establish new feeding grounds. The will, Silas, the old cynic, is the hardest to convince, but he becomes the strategist. He realizes that if the reptilians are now physical, they can be killed by physical means. He begins to synthesize resonance bombs, using Nordic schematics and salvaged technology from the destroyed data center. The turning point. The trust pays off when Ethel reveals the true scale of the threat. The reptilian elites are not just in the shadows, they have integrated into the highest levels of the world's power structures, and with the simulation down, they are moving to initiate a scorched earth policy. They plan to trigger global industrial failures to create mass chaos, which they believe will make the human population easier to cull. Luke, now equipped with a suit of Nordic light weave armor that feels as light as cotton but absorbs kinetic impact like a tank, prepares for the first major strike. They're gathering at the UN headquarters, Elara says, pointing to a holographic projection of the globe. They're going to use the summit to signal the rest of their hives across the planet. Luke looks at Ethel. The Nordic guardian stands poised, her presence radiating a calm, terrifying confidence. We do not fight this war for you, Ethel says, her eyes glowing with starlight. We provide the frequency. You provide the fire. Luke nods, grabbing a heavy, hum-charged pulse rifle provided by the Nordics. He looks at Silas and Elara. They aren't just drifters or researchers anymore. They are the tip of the spear for a humanity that has been a slave for millennia. Let's show them, Luke says, his voice steady and cold, what happens when the cattle decide they're tired of being fed. The assault on the UN headquarters was not a battle, it was a reclamation. As the summit commenced, the reptilian elites gathered on the podium, their human disguises already beginning to slough away, revealing the raw, iridescent scales beneath. They were ready to broadcast the culling signal that would plunge the world into darkness. But they didn't account for the resonance. Luke, Elara, and Silas hit the perimeter like a kinetic storm. Guided by Elara's tactical overlays and armed with the harmonic pulse rifles provided by the Nordics, they shattered the reptilians' defensive shields in seconds. Above the city, the Nordic ships descended, a silent, silver fleet that acted as an acoustic dampener, stripping the reptilians of their ability to manipulate local gravity and matter. The defeat was absolute. Without the simulation to hide behind and the Nordic frequency pinning them down, the elites were exposed as nothing more than parasitic invaders. As the resonance field intensified, the creatures' physical forms collapsed into dark, viscous sludge. Realizing the tide had turned, and that they were no longer the apex predators of this world, the remaining reptilian forces scrambled for their subterranean exit points, abandoning the surface of the Earth to flee into the deep, dark corners of the solar system. The world woke up to a new reality. The magic of the elite was gone, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful truth of a liberated planet. In the weeks that followed, the Nordic ships remained in orbit, a silent, shimmering guardian fleet. Ethel and her kin oversaw the dismantling of the global harvesting infrastructure, but they kept their distance. They taught humanity how to scrub the resonance from their own minds, shared the blueprints for clean, non-exploitative energy, and then, as promised, pulled back. They would not be our new masters. They would be the silent watchmen on the porch, ensuring no other parasite ever turned their eyes toward Earth again. For Silas, the war was his life's work. He became the architect of the new world, spending his days ensuring the old hierarchies of the elites could never be rebuilt. But for Luke and Elara, the war was a door they had finally closed. They found a quiet, rugged plot of land in the high northern wilderness, far from the neon hum of the cities and the cold, sterile shadows of the data centers. Here, the air was crisp, and the only sound was the wind moving through the pines. There were no glitched screens, no hidden frequency hums, and no reptilian eyes watching from the dark. For the first time in his many lives, Luke felt the weight of the earth beneath his boots and knew it was his own. He was no longer a drifter, he was home. Elara kept a small, handheld console, not to monitor the world, but to watch the stars. She and Luke would sit on the porch at night, wrapped in heavy wool blankets, watching the silver lights of the Nordic ships dancing like distant, silent fireflies in the upper atmosphere. They were the stars that protected the garden, but they were no longer the gardeners. They had been forged in the fire of a digital hell, only to discover that the most profound human experience wasn't in conquering the universe or hacking the code of reality. It was in the simple, quiet act of being truly present, together, under a sky that was finally, unequivocally real. And in the silence of that vast, wild frontier, the loop remained broken, and the future was finally, for the first time, entirely their own. The moment Elara's hand touched Luke, the air in the trench didn't just flicker, it screamed. A low-frequency hum, deep enough to vibrate the marrow in their bones, surged through the site. Above them, the site's automated surveillance drones, which usually hovered like indifferent hawks, snapped to a halt. Their lenses rotated in perfect unison, locking onto the trench. "They've flagged the variants," Elara hissed, pulling a small, jagged piece of obsidian-like glass from her vest. "They know we're out of sync." Suddenly, the construction workers above the pit stopped moving. Their motions weren't human. They were jerky, frame-skipped movements. Two of them jumped into the pit. They didn't land with the thud of work boots. They landed with the sickening, fluid thud of heavy, wet meat. As they stood, their skin rippled, a momentary, translucent flash revealing dark, hexagonal scales beneath the synthetic human facade. "Enforcers," Luke grunted, hefting his industrial drill like a mace. "Whatever those things are, they aren't wearing hard hats for the safety." The enforcers didn't speak. They lunged. Luke moved with a lifetime of blue-collar instinct. He swung the drill, not at the enforcers' heads, but at the scaffolding pipe behind them. As the metal groaned and twisted, Elara slammed the glass shard into the dirt. A shockwave of distorted reality rippled outward, turning the ground into a liquid, non-Euclidean trap. The enforcers stumbled, their forms glitching violently as they tried to recalculate their position. "Move," Elara screamed. They scrambled out of the trench, sprinting through the skeletal frame of the data center. The world around them was falling apart. Walls dissolved into streams of raw code, and the sky turned a deep, bruised violet. They reached the edge of the site, where a rusted, nondescript cargo van waited. A man was sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't look back until they slammed the doors shut. Silas turned the key. The engine didn't roar. It emitted a high-pitched, crystalline chime that immediately canceled out the humming threat behind them. The site vanished in the rearview mirror, replaced by the mundane, flickering lights of the city highway. "You're late," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the road, though he didn't seem to be looking at the pavement. He was watching the weather, the way the streetlights stuttered in a rhythmic code. "They found the anomaly," Elara breathed, clutching her side. "They're running a hard reset on the sector." Silas nodded, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had seen the universe end 1,000 times. He looked at Luke in the rearview mirror. "You smell like raw earth, boy. That's good. It means you haven't been synced yet." "Who are you?" Luke demanded, his adrenaline slowly fading into a cold, hard rage. "I'm the one who stops you from being recycled," Silas replied. He pulled the van into a dark, abandoned industrial tunnel. "You've spent your lives thinking you were drifting, working, and living. You were just fuel for their server banks." He hit a switch on the dashboard. The van's interior lights went black, and the walls of the tunnel seemed to peel away, revealing a hidden, subterranean bunker built into the side of an old, abandoned subway line. "Welcome to the real," Silas said, stepping out into the damp, cold dark. "Now, let's talk about how we kill a god." The silence that followed the collapse was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of a predator holding its breath. Elara knelt over Luke's limp form, her hands hovering just inches from his chest. She expected the chaotic screams of a waking city, the panic of millions realizing their reality had been a digital parlor trick. Instead, the world outside the data center remained eerily muffled, as if the planet were still shivering from the shock of the reboot. Silas stepped over the jagged, steaming remains of the crystalline pillar, his eyes tracking the shadows in the corners of the room. He didn't look triumphant, he looked terrified. "They're still here," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of failing electronics. Elara stood up, her grip tightening on her weapon. "The simulation is gone. I can see the real sky, Silas. I can see the stars. They lost the frequency. They've been unmasked. They were never just the frequency, Elara," Silas said, kicking aside a piece of glowing debris. "The frequency was just their leash. It kept us blind so they could feed without a struggle. Now," he gestured to the shadows, which were no longer dissolving. They were solidifying. The shadows began to peel away from the walls, taking on the hulking, physical forms of the elites. But they weren't glitching anymore. They weren't phasing in and out of the digital grid. They were standing firmly on the concrete floor, their scales dull, dark, and terrifyingly real. They weren't creatures of code. They were biological. They were physical. And they were looking at the trio not with the cold logic of an operating system, but with the raw, focused hunger of a pack of wolves that had finally cornered their prey. One of them stepped forward. It didn't hum into their skulls this time. It opened a jagged, tooth-filled maw, and a guttural, wet sound escaped, a language that predated humanity. "You did not break our house," the creature hissed, its voice gravel and wrought. "You merely turned off the lights." It reached out, and for the first time, Elara saw the reality of the threat. They didn't need a simulation to hunt them anymore. The Great Reset hadn't been about maintaining the prison, it had been a fail-safe, a way to keep the cattle from realizing that the butchers were standing right next to them in the dark. Luke's hand suddenly twitched, his eyes snapped open, glowing with a faint, residual hum of the data stream he had just traversed. He gasped, his lungs dragging in the cold, unfiltered air of a world that had been hiding them for millennia. He looked at the looming, physical monsters, and a grim, lopsided smile touched his lips. "So," Luke rasped, pushing himself to his feet, his hands balled into fists. "We're done playing in the machine. Now we actually have to fight." Silas drew a blade forged from the same non-conductive, etched stone as the gauntlet. "The simulation was the easy part, kid. We just declared war on a species that's been eating us since we learned to walk upright." The elite at the front lunged, its claws tearing through the heavy concrete floor as if it were parchment. The hunt had begun, and for the first time, there were no glitches, no resets, and no escape.